It's time now for perspective. Global democratic freedoms are more fragile now than they have been in years, with the global Covid-19 pandemic prompting sweeping restrictions on civil liberties and providing autocratic regimes with a handy pretext for crackdowns on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Those are just a few of the key findings of the recently published 2020 Democracy Index from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and its editor, Joan Hoey, is my guest today. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today on France 24. Now, 2020 was an extraordinary year in so many ways, with even the world's most developed democracies enforcing lockdowns of various severities and lengths. From a civil liberties perspective, just how momentous has this last year been?
Well, I would say probably unprecedented. We saw this huge rollback of democratic freedom, civil liberties across the globe, including in the most developed democracies in the world. And I think we haven't seen that before in peacetime, and perhaps not even in wartime.
And which countries would you say have seen the greatest changes when it comes to democratic freedoms?
So overall, what we saw last year in terms of our index, which covers 167 countries in the world, the average score, that's the average score of all those 167 countries, fell to an all-time low from the lifetime of the index. And striking, I guess, the biggest regression was in the authoritarian countries, where many autocrats, authoritarian leaders, used the cover of the pandemic to crack down on their opponents and impose coercion and control over their populations. But I guess the striking thing for us was that it was in Europe, in North America, in democracies in Latin America, where we saw this huge rollback of freedoms. And so I guess that's the most striking result. And in our index, two questions in particular, two indicators that we look at, saw most countries and most democracies downgraded. That was an indicator in our civil liberties category that looks at personal freedoms, freedom of travel, freedom of movement, freedom of association, and so on. That was downgraded across the board in more or less all the world's democracies. Another question in our functioning of government category, which has to do with popular perceptions of citizens' freedom of choice and control over their lives, that was also downgraded across the board. So I think every government was faced with difficult choices between saving lives and sacrificing liberties. And that was a dilemma that was probably felt most of all in the world's democracies, developed democracies.
Now, we have just learned that the government in the Netherlands is in the process of appealing a ruling that found the country's current overnight curfew wasn't sufficiently justified in law. If that decision from that lower court is upheld, will you see that as a victory for democracy? Because many people would see it as something of a kick in the teeth for the government's coronavirus strategy.
Yeah, so this gets to the heart of the dilemma, which all individuals faced and all governments faced, because of course there's been an incredible amount of public compliance and consent for this withdrawal of liberties faced with this new deadly disease to which humans had no immunity. People made the choice that it was worth a temporary sacrifice of freedoms in the cause of saving lives and preventing a more catastrophic loss of lives. And that choice wasn't easy for anybody to make. Most people have made very big sacrifices in terms of their livelihoods, as well as their individual freedoms, their ability to see family and friends, social interaction, and so on. It wasn't easy, but then I guess most people concluded that we're all here, we live in a world, men and women, and we cannot be free alone. And no matter how difficult those choices were, people were prepared to make them. And I guess over the course of the year, what we've seen is that nobody has really put forward a convincing alternative to the policy of lockdowns and social distancing and track and trace and so on, in terms of getting control over transmission of the virus and saving lives. So this was the difficult dilemma. That doesn't mean that government shouldn't be criticised in the way that they went about it, that there should be, of course, proper checks and balances on the measures, these extraordinary measures that were taken, and some countries were downgraded because they didn't have proper checks and balances and scrutiny. There wasn't sufficient openness and transparency about what was done. But nevertheless, ultimately, the majority of people, as I said, were prepared to accept these measures in the cause of saving lives. I don't think we should be criticising people who ask questions about the costs of lockdown. I certainly don't think we should be censoring those people who ask these difficult questions. These are things that should be subject to scrutiny because, after all, it's no small thing to withdraw people's personal freedoms and liberties on this scale. And even if we decide at the end of the day that it's worth it, temporarily at least, nevertheless, we should have a full and proper debate about it.
Now, the pandemic has exacerbated wealth inequality in countries rich and poor. In your report, you make a link between rising poverty and governments' abilities to erode personal freedoms. Could you tell me a little more about that?
I think we make a distinction between some of the management of the pandemic, perhaps in developed democracies and in emerging markets. And I guess this was one division that was quite noticeable. So what we saw in more authoritarian countries or less democratic countries, countries that we categorize as flawed democracies or hybrid regimes or authoritarian regimes, we saw there were fewer qualms on the part of governments and leaders about taking away people's freedoms, using perhaps more coercive measures to deal with the pandemic. And to a large extent, some rulers did use the pandemic as an excuse to crack down on dissent, to crack down on their opponents, to restrict civil liberties, freedom of protest, and so on. Because in recent years, especially in emerging markets in Latin America, in the Middle East and North Africa, other places in Africa also, we've seen a rising protest movement. And the pandemic more or less has brought that to a halt. My expectation would be that the economic and social fallout from the pandemic will result in an upsurge of political protest and social unrest in emerging markets. I mean, we're already seeing that, of course, in developed democracies as well, where as the pandemic has gone on, the degree to which people are prepared to put up with these restrictions, infringements of freedoms, is becoming less and less.
Joan Hoey, thank you so much for speaking to us here on France 24 today. Joan Hoey, a Europe editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Thank you.